They would remember the night not for its music, nor for the brilliance of its chandeliers, but for the moment when a woman learned how quickly admiration curdles into silence. The ballroom of Harrington House gleamed with polished marble and gold-leafed mirrors, every surface designed to multiply beauty and deny decay. Candlelight clung to silk gowns like liquid fire, and the air trembled with violins tuned to delight. It was a room built for promises. It was here that Miss Eleanor Ashcombe was undone. She stood near the eastern colonnade, pale blue satin falling from her shoulders in careful folds, her gloved hands resting one atop the other as though trained to stillness. There had been a time, not an hour earlier, when she was the object of benign curiosity. Guests had smiled at her with the indulgence reserved for women safely claimed, women whose futures had already been decided by a gentleman's name. That protection had vanished with astonishing speed. Mr. Charles Whitcomb approached her with the measured grace of a man who feared disorder more than cruelty. His dark coat was impeccable, his expression calm, almost sorrowful. Those nearest leaned in, sensing a disturbance, for society possesses a predatory instinct for weakness. Eleanor saw his lips move and prepared herself for tenderness. Instead, she received precision. "My dear Miss Ashcombe," he said softly, as if kindness could be preserved through tone alone, "I find myself compelled by conscience to release you from an understanding that no longer serves either of us." The words fell between them like snow, soundless yet suffocating. Eleanor's breath caught, not in drama, but in disbelief. She searched his face for some private explanation, some flicker of regret meant only for her. There was none. His gaze slid away, already disengaging, already calculating the aftermath. He bowed, the gesture immaculate, and stepped back as though the matter were concluded. Around them, the room inhaled. Whispers unfurled with the speed of silk unspooling. Fans fluttered, not for warmth but for concealment. Eyes, moments ago warm, turned sharp with interest or skittered aside in practiced mercy. Eleanor felt herself hollowed by a single realization. Disgrace travels faster than truth. No explanation was offered, none required. A broken engagement needed no villain, only a woman left standing. She did not cry. That would have invited sympathy, and sympathy was merely humiliation disguised as grace. Instead, she inclined her head, acknowledging the invisible jury encircling her. Years of careful breeding guided her movements when feeling had fled. She moved toward the edge of the room as the orchestra resumed, the violins rising in fragile defiance of the rupture they could not mend. The narrator of such evenings, had there been one, might have observed how society pretends not to see what it cannot forgive. Eleanor passed clusters of guests who found sudden fascination in chandeliers, in lace cuffs, in anything that absolved them of witness. She felt no anger yet, only a keen, lucid awareness that she had crossed an invisible border. She was no longer an anticipated future. She was a caution. At the cloakroom, her maid reached for her wrap, hesitating as though awaiting instruction. Eleanor nodded once. The girl's eyes were wide with loyalty and terror in equal measure. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft at first, misting the windows and blurring the world into indistinct shapes. Eleanor welcomed it. Rain asked no questions. She descended the steps alone. The night air struck her cheeks, cold and immediate, and for the first time since Mr. Whitcomb's words, she allowed herself a breath that was not composed. The street glistened under lamplight, carriages lined in orderly expectation, the doors held open by footmen who suddenly found her unassigned. She walked past them, the sound of her slippers muffled by wet stone. Behind her, Harrington House continued without pause. Laughter escaped through the doors, lights spilled outward, and the orchestra played on. The world had not ended. Only her place within it had shifted. Eleanor reached the pavement and paused, uncertain where to go. Home felt impossibly distant, and yet remaining was unthinkable. She lifted her chin, drawing dignity around her like armor, and stepped into the rain. It soaked her hairline, darkened the hem of her gown, erased the careful perfection she had worn like a promise. Each drop felt earned. Then, through the rhythm of rainfall, another sound emerged. Slower, heavier, the deliberate turn of wheels upon stone. Eleanor stopped as a carriage drew nearer, its lanterns cutting warm arcs through the night, its crest unmistakable even through the veil of rain. The footman descended not with haste, but with certainty, and opened the door as if this moment had always been expected. Eleanor's heart struck once, sharply, not with hope but with confusion. No invitation had been extended to her, no command given. Yet the carriage waited, solid and patient, as though the night itself had made room for her. She did not know whose arms were etched upon its side, only that they belonged to a rank enough to invite questions and low enough in mercy to avoid spectacle. The footman inclined his head, respectful, silent, offering neither explanation nor pressure. For a breath, she considered refusal. Pride urged her to retreat into anonymity, to walk until her shoes were ruined and her name forgotten. But another instinct, quieter and more dangerous, stirred beneath the ache of humiliation. It whispered that not all witnesses come to wound, and not all endings are final. Eleanor stepped closer, rain sliding from her lashes, her reflection wavering in the polished door. Somewhere behind her, the ballroom glittered, convinced it had finished with her. She placed her gloved hand upon the carriage frame, feeling the warmth held within, and hesitated just long enough for the night to notice. Then, with no word spoken and no promise given, she accepted the open door, unaware that society was about to speak her name again, this time with fear. Morning arrived without ceremony, as though the night's drama had been a rumor the sun refused to confirm. Eleanor awoke in her modest bedchamber with the echo of carriage wheels still turning in her mind, their promise unresolved, the destination unnamed. The house was quiet, respectful in its restraint, yet she felt observed by every polished surface and ticking clock. Shame, she discovered, lingered longer in daylight. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing gray rather than blue, mourning rather than allure, and descended to breakfast with the composure of a woman accustomed to swallowing astonishment. The servants spoke little, but their glances lingered. News traveled through households as efficiently as smoke, and by the time she lifted her teacup, she knew Harrington House had followed her home. A broken engagement was never private, it was a public education. Before noon, the first token arrived. A small parcel, wrapped in cream paper and sealed with deep red wax, was delivered by a footman she did not recognize. No name accompanied it, only a crest impressed with such authority that Eleanor's fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside lay a slender volume of poetry, its margins worn, its ribbon marking a passage on endurance. No message followed, yet the gesture spoke with unsettling intimacy. She closed the book as though it might bane her. A gift, unannounced and unclaimed, was a provocation in itself. To receive anything so soon after disgrace suggested either pity or audacity, and Eleanor could not yet decide which wounded more deeply. She placed the volume upon her desk, resisting the urge to hide it, and waited for the day to declare its intentions. By afternoon, whispers had thickened into narrative. Eleanor felt them in the altered cadence of visits declined, in the sudden politeness of acquaintances who had once been careless with affection. At the milliner's, conversation paused as she entered, then resumed too brightly, as though her presence required compensation. She understood now that scandal did not shout. It insinuated, curling into every space until silence itself felt accusatory. The second token arrived the following morning, delivered with equal discretion. This time it was a bouquet, winter roses pale as secrets, bound with silver thread. Their fragrance filled the room, softening the air, and Eleanor felt an uninvited warmth rise behind her eyes. Flowers were language, unmistakably so, and these spoke not of apology but of attention. Someone was watching her survive. Speculation sharpened. A duke's name was not spoken, but rank was inferred with breathless excitement. The carriage that had borne her away became legend, embellished with each retelling. Some suggested charity, others a dangerous fancy. Eleanor heard it all second-hand, her own story retold without her consent. The attention frightened her, yet beneath fear stirred a reluctant curiosity about the man who had intervened without claiming her. It was at Lady Fenwick's music hall that he appeared. The room was smaller than Harrington House, yet no less vigilant, every chair aligned toward judgment. Eleanor sat near the window, resigned to invisibility, when conversation faltered again. He stood across the room, tall, composed, his presence exerting a gravity she felt before she understood. When his gaze met hers, it did not skim or assess. It settled. No announcement accompanied him. No flourish betrayed intention. Yet Eleanor knew, with a certainty that startled her, that this was the architect of her unrest. He inclined his head, a gesture both respectful and restrained, and did not approach. That restraint, more than boldness, unsettled her. It suggested patience, and patience implied design. Society watched, breath held, sensing the axis of the room shift. Later, a note was pressed discreetly into her hand, the paper warm from another's grasp. The script was elegant, spare. He requested nothing. He merely hoped she found the evening tolerable, and that the Rosies had survived the journey. The absence of presumption felt deliberate, almost daring. Eleanor folded the note, her pulse betraying her calm, aware that kindness could be as dangerous as cruelty. The following days brought no retreat. More books appeared, each chosen with unnerving precision, passages underlined as though in conversation. Eleanor read them slowly, sensing an unseen dialogue forming. Her fears softened into something sharper, anticipation. Yet with it came peril. Every kindness deepened the scandal, every silence invited invention. To be noticed by power was not salvation, it was exposure. Eleanor began to understand the shape of her choice. She could retreat into obscurity, allowing rumor to calcify into truth, or she could stand within the light now cast upon her and risk being burned. The man who sent these tokens had not spoken her name aloud, yet he had rewritten it in whispers. She wondered whether he understood the cost of his attention, or whether he intended to pay it. On the evening she was invited again into public view, Eleanor stood before her mirror, fastening her gloves with deliberate care. She felt no illusion of rescue now, only the tightening arc of consequence. Outside, a familiar carriage waited, its presence no longer shocking but inevitable. As she stepped toward it, aware of unseen eyes and sharpened tongues, she understood that whatever followed would not be bestowed upon her in secret. It would unfold where society could not look away, and where one man's regard might demand more courage than she possessed. The rain threatened again, low clouds pressing close, mirroring the weight within her chest. She paused, hand upon the carriage door, recalling the night of her humiliation and the silence that followed. This time, silence felt charged, expectant. She did not know whether she was stepping toward redemption or deeper ruin, only that the world was watching, and she was no longer invisible. Somewhere within the carriage, a presence waited, patient as before, unwilling to name itself yet refusing to retreat. Eleanor inhaled, tasting rain and resolve together, and stepped forward, knowing that whatever scandal bloomed next would carry her irrevocably toward him. Slowly, the door closed behind her. The room he chose for their meeting was neither grand nor forgiving. It was a private library, removed from the spectacle of his estate, lined with dark shelves that bore the weight of generations. Firelight moved across the spines of books like restless memory, and the windows were shuttered against the evening, as though the world itself had been politely dismissed. Eleanor stood near the hearth, her gloves folded in her hands, feeling the quiet press upon her nerves. He entered without announcement, closing the door himself. The sound was deliberate, final. In the softer light, she saw him clearly for the first time. Not merely a presence, but a man marked by restraint. His features were composed rather than handsome, his expression thoughtful, as though words were objects to be handled with care. He inclined his head, neither superior nor familiar, and spoke her name once, testing its weight. "Miss Ashcombe." She answered with a bow that acknowledged courtesy but offered nothing more. The silence that followed was not empty. It stretched, taut with things unsaid, until the fire shifted and reminded them both that time had not paused for propriety. He gestured to a chair, but she remained standing, unwilling to be settled before understanding the ground beneath her. "I owe you clarity," he said at last, "and perhaps an apology, though I hope you will allow me to explain before you decide whether one is warranted. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. Explanations are costly, Your Grace. They tend to demand belief. A flicker of something like admiration crossed his face. Then I shall ask for neither belief nor forgiveness. Only attention. He paused, then added quietly, My name is Julian Harrowby, Duke of Redford. The title settled between them with measured force. Eleanor felt its implications bloom, heavy and unavoidable. A duke's interest was not merely personal. It was political, social, irrevocable. She understood now why whispers had grown teeth. I did not send for you to repair your reputation, he continued, as if reading her thoughts, nor to display my power beneath the guise of kindness. I intervened because I recognized something in you that night, and because I feared what would happen if I did not. She drew a slow breath. You feared gossip. I feared erasure, he replied. I have watched society punish women for surviving disappointment with dignity. You were prepared to vanish, Miss Ashcombe, and the world would have congratulated itself on its mercy. The words struck deeper than accusation. Eleanor felt the truth of them resonate with a painful clarity. She had been ready to become smaller, quieter, safer. She had been taught that such retreat was virtue. You do not know me, she said, though her voice softened. You know a moment. He nodded. And moments are often truer than histories. I observed you long before your engagement was announced. I admired your silence. Not the silence of submission, but of discernment. You listened when others performed. That is rare. Her hands tightened around her gloves. Praise unsettled her more than condemnation. And yet you chose to speak for me without permission. Yes, he said, without evasion. That was my arrogance. I believed the risk preferable to inaction. Eleanor turned toward the fire, its warmth suddenly oppressive. Do you know what your attention costs me? Every kindness you extend becomes a question I must answer. Every silence you keep invites interpretation. I'm no longer free to be ordinary. Julian stepped closer, stopping well short of intrusion. Nor am I free to be careless. That is why I asked to speak with you privately. I will not continue unless you wish it. The simplicity of the offer startled her. No demand, no persuasion. Just choice, placed carefully at her feet. Eleanor met his gaze again, searching for pity and finding none. Instead, she saw resolve tempered by restraint. What is it you wish, Your Grace? She asked. He considered her for a long moment. To know you, he said finally, not as a cause or a curiosity, but as a woman whose endurance commands respect. If that knowledge leads nowhere, I will accept the cost. But I could not leave the question unasked. The fire cracked, punctuating his words. Eleanor felt something within her shift, a subtle reordering of fear and desire. She had been spoken for, spoken about, spoken over. Now she was being addressed. I am afraid, she admitted, the confession barely audible. Not of scandal, but of being mistaken for someone who needs saving. Julian's voice lowered. Then allow me to be clear. I do not wish to save you. I wish to stand beside you, if you permit it. She moved at last, crossing to the window though the shutters were closed, tracing the wood grain as if it were a map. If you stand beside me, she said, you will be judged for my past, not admired for your courage. I will not have you resent me when admiration fades. Julian answered without haste, telling her of a life shaped by observation rather than appetite, of a title inherited too young and expectations that narrowed choice rather than expanded it. He spoke of loneliness without complaint, of duty without romance, and of how witnessing her composure in disgrace had unsettled him more than beauty ever could. Eleanor listened, surprised by how his candor made room for her own breath. She sensed the careful symmetry of two guarded lives approaching alignment, not collision. The firelight softened the edges of his face, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether safety was merely another word for stagnation. Awaiting dawn, the restraint in his words carried more weight than any declaration. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, feeling the room hold its breath. She did not yet know her answer, only that it would change everything. Outside, the night pressed close to the shutters, listening, waiting for a choice that could not be taken back. The assembly at Wilthorn Hall was announced as a charitable gathering, but charity was never its true purpose. It was a tribunal disguised as civility, a place where reputations were weighed beneath chandeliers and sentences delivered through glances. Eleanor arrived with measured calm, her entrance neither hesitant nor bold, and felt the collective attention pivot toward her as if summoned. Her gown was ivory, unadorned, chosen not to dazzle but to endure scrutiny. She had decided, if she must be judged, to offer no spectacle. Julian stood already among the company, his posture composed, his presence unmistakable. He did not approach her immediately. Instead, he allowed the room to observe them separately, to construct its theories, to sharpen its appetite. Eleanor recognized the strategy and felt gratitude mingle with dread. By delaying, he denied gossip its favorite indulgence, immediacy. Yet she knew delay could not prevent the inevitable. Their paths were converging, and the room sensed it. Conversation resumed in fragments. Laughter pitched a note too high. Eleanor moved through the crowd with practiced courtesy, her replies precise, her smile reserved. She was no longer invisible, nor was she welcomed. She existed in that perilous middle ground where fascination and disapproval coexist. Each step felt deliberate, a declaration without words that she would not retreat. Across the room, Julian watched, his attention steady, offering no rescue yet withholding nothing. The moment came not with drama but with inevitability. A pause in the music, an intake of breath, and Julian crossed the floor. He stopped before Eleanor, bowed, and addressed her with quiet formality. Their exchange was brief, audible enough to invite attention, restrained enough to command it. He asked if she would walk with him. She accepted without hesitation, aware that refusal would invite its own conclusions. They moved to the center of the room, not isolated yet unmistakably aligned. Julian turned to the assembled guests, his voice calm, carrying without force. He spoke not of affection, nor of intent, but of regard. He acknowledged Eleanor's recent trial without naming its source, praised her composure without condescension, and declared that her character, observed under strain, merited respect rather than suspicion. The words landed with weight precisely because they were measured. A murmur rippled outward. Eleanor felt the shift as a physical sensation, like pressure easing. Julian continued, stating that he accepted full responsibility for the attention he had shown her, that any speculation should find its answer in him. He offered no apology for interest, no justification beyond sincerity. In doing so, he claimed the narrative, drawing its teeth. Society, accustomed to equivocation, found itself disarmed by clarity. Silence followed, thick and contemplative. Eleanor stood beside him, her pulse steadying as understanding dawned. This was not a rescue staged for admiration. It was a choice, publicly assumed, consequences acknowledged. She realized then that dignity could be defended without aggression, that one could confront judgment without mirroring its cruelty. The room seemed to exhale, unsure whether it had witnessed impropriety or principle. From the periphery emerged Charles Whitcomb, pale with purpose. His approach was hesitant, his smile strained into courtesy. He addressed Julian with formal respect, then turned to Eleanor, his tone conciliatory. He spoke of misunderstandings, of private matters made public, of regret for distress caused. The words were careful, crafted to reclaim authority without surrender. Eleanor listened, recognizing the attempt to rewrite history in softer ink. Julian answered before she could. His response was brief, unmistakable. He declined reconciliation on Eleanor's behalf, stating that what had been relinquished could not be reclaimed through convenience. He spoke not with disdain but with finality, and in doing so, closed a door society had left ajar. Whitcomb withdrew, his retreat more damaging than any rebuke. The past, confronted, had lost its hold. Eleanor felt something within her settle. The room no longer pressed upon her. It receded, its judgment diluted by uncertainty. She met Julian's gaze, finding there no triumph, only resolve. In that moment, she understood the cost he had accepted and the courage it required. She also understood her own. To stand beside him now was to step into visibility without armor, to allow regard to become responsibility. As the gathering dissolved into cautious conversation, Eleanor and Julian remained where they were, no longer the center yet undeniably altered. She knew this was not an ending, only a declaration that would echo beyond the room. The future waited, unscripted, attentive. When Julian offered his arm once more, she took it, aware that every step forward would be observed, measured, remembered. Together they moved toward the exit, leaving behind a silence charged with consequence, and a society uncertain whether it had just witnessed a scandal or the beginning of something it could not undo. The weeks that followed did not erupt as scandal had promised. Instead, they settled into something more dangerous, a recalibration. Society, having spent its outrage, turned cautious, watching to see whether defiance would harden into permanence or dissolve into apology. Eleanor felt the shift acutely. Doors once closed reopened with tentative courtesy. Invitations arrived bearing neutrality rather than warmth. She understood the test being conducted and did not rush to satisfy it. Julian did not press his advantage. He visited rarely, always announced, his conduct impeccable to the point of austerity. Yet in every restraint lay intention. When he spoke to Eleanor, it was never of reputation but of weather, of books, of the quiet pleasures of observation. He allowed her space to choose, knowing that a choice freely made carried a different weight than one coaxed into being. It was Eleanor who asked to see Redford. The estate rose from the countryside with dignified patience, neither ostentatious nor withdrawn. Stone warmed by late afternoon light, gardens disciplined into calm abundance. Eleanor arrived without ceremony, her heart steady but alert. This was not a visit for inspection. It was an encounter with consequence. If she stepped fully into his world, she would not leave unchanged. They walked together through the gardens, the gravel path sounding beneath their steps like punctuation. Julian spoke of duty without romance, of inheritance that felt less like privilege than vigilance. Eleanor listened, recognizing the familiar burden of expectation shaped differently but no less exacting. When they reached the far edge of the grounds, where the land dipped and the house receded, he stopped. "I will not pretend," he said, turning to her, "that this path leads to ease. Whatever regard exists between us will be weighed against tradition, against envy, against the quiet resentment reserved for those who refuse to accept their assigned place." Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm accustomed to being weighed," she replied. "What I will not endure again is being measured without consent." Julian inclined his head. "Then let this be consent," he said, his voice low but certain. "Not to marriage, not yet, but to intention. I wish to build something with you that does not require your diminishment." The words settled slowly, not as a promise but as an offering. Eleanor felt the final remnants of her old caution stir, then quiet. She had survived shame. She had stood beneath judgment and remained herself. The fear that once governed her choices no longer commanded obedience. "I accept," she said, simply. The change was immediate, not in spectacle but in gravity. Julian exhaled, as though a tension long held had found release. He did not reach for her hand at once. When he did, the contact was measured, reverent, acknowledging not possession but alignment. Eleanor felt the future open, vast and uncharted, and understood that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it held fast. News traveled, as it always did, but its tone had altered. What could not be undone became accepted. Society adjusted its posture, some with admiration, others with resignation. Eleanor observed the transformation without triumph. Vindication was less satisfying than peace. The final reckoning came quietly. At a small gathering weeks later, Whitcomb approached her once more, his manner subdued. He offered apology without expectation, his voice stripped of authority. Eleanor received it without bitterness, recognizing that closure need not be dramatic to be complete. When he withdrew, she felt no loss, only relief. That evening, Eleanor and Julian stood together on the terrace at Redford, the sky deepening into indigo. The air carried the scent of earth after rain, clean, and resolved. Carriages departed in the distance, their wheels fading into memory rather than arrival. Eleanor watched them go, aware of how once she had waited for such sounds to determine her fate. Julian spoke beside her. "The world will continue to watch," he said. "It always does." Eleanor smiled, the expression unguarded. "Then let it," she replied. "I have spent enough time living quietly for its comfort." They did not kiss beneath the stars, nor did they speak vows. What passed between them was steadier, more enduring. A mutual understanding, forged not in secrecy or spectacle, but in the shared decision to stand visible and unashamed. As night settled fully, Eleanor felt the last echo of the storm leave her chest. What remained was not triumph, nor romance untested, but something rarer, the certainty that she had chosen herself, and that in doing so, she had been chosen in return.